The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Welcome back to part 2 of episode 57 of Things Are About to Get Weird. I hope you're all well. It's been a good few weeks since part 1 of this instalment, which is dedicated to the very mysterious story of the Isdal Woman. So I will be giving you a little bit of a recap before we continue. Do bear in mind that, like in the first part, there will be some graphic details in this one, as well as references to a person taking their own life, so please do be aware of that. In the spirit of jumping right back into things, I'm going to keep this intro short. Let's re-immerse ourselves into this incredibly strange tale. We ended part 1 of this episode under that familiar, frustrating cloud that many unsolved cases rest beneath. Years had begun to pass since the discovery of the charred remains of an unidentified person, who came to be known as the Isdal Woman, which were found in November of 1970 in a rural area of Norway called Isdalen. Police in Norway had done all they could think of. They'd analysed belongings of hers found both near to her body and within suitcases later found at Bergen's railway station. But as pretty much every item connected to her had been deliberately scrubbed of almost all identifying features, this proved to be a fairly fruitless exercise. They'd managed to trace some of her movements prior to her death, identifying a number of hotels she'd stayed at before her untimely passing. They'd spoken to eyewitnesses, people who'd interacted with or observed her in the months, weeks, and even hours before she died. But despite it becoming apparent that she'd gone by many different aliases, her true name still eluded them. The Isdal Woman's autopsy concluded that she had taken her own life, but this possibility had struck many of the officers involved in the investigation as impossible, or at least highly unlikely. The manner in which she had died was so brutal that it appeared odd to suggest that she had put herself through such torture. Though the investigation soon stalled and the case officially went cold, several theories were floated to try and explain what could have happened to the Jane Doe. It was heavily implied that she may have been a spy and could have been killed for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or that she was a fugitive on the run from another country and had met with foul play whilst trying to avoid capture. But with little solid evidence to bolster these theories back in the 1970s, time continued to pass with no definite answers. And although there were always still murmurings amongst the public and true crime enthusiasts, from an official standpoint it looked as though there was nothing more to be done. That was until 2016. Now, something important to note about the Isdal Woman is that she had quite a distinctive set of teeth. And this detail becomes extra vital when you think about the fact that, as so much of her body was destroyed beyond recognition when she was burned, her teeth remained largely unaffected, meaning that naturally they became a significant piece of physical evidence in the case. What made them so unique was the fact that she had 14 different fillings, plus a number of gold crowns, and the type of dental work she had done was not the norm in Norway. It stood out as both unusual for the area, as well as for someone of their age the Isdal Woman was presumed to be. At the time of the investigation, a professor of dentistry named Gisle Bang recognized how invaluable the jawbone and attached teeth could be should any future developments take place in the case, and he made the very smart decision to keep them safe. But sadly, as so much time went by with the investigation remaining both closed and cold, Gisle passed away in 2011 before he could see his preservation of the teeth become a key part of any future lines of questioning. After he died, the whereabouts of this evidence became somewhat of a mystery itself. The forensic doctor who was handed the Isdal Woman case files was told that the jawbone had been discarded as it had started to smell, which made me feel a bit queasy, sorry about having to share that detail. And from this, it was accepted that the teeth had been lost, and that this piece of the puzzle was no longer available to anyone wishing to try and make sense of the case. However, this is where we're introduced to some new players in this story, journalists from the Norwegian National Broadcasting Organisation, NRK. By 2016, this unsolved tale was still gripping many who wished to see the Isdal Woman finally identified, and the journalists began looking at the case with fresh eyes. And during the course of their research, the new forensic doctor in charge of the files that they were conversing with, Professor Inge Morild, made a discovery. When searching through the Helgeland University Hospital's forensic archives, the professor found the Isdal Woman's jawbone and teeth deep within a cellar. And this prompted what you could describe as the modern phase of the investigation, a description made all the more legitimate by the fact that the Norwegian police reopened the case. It was felt that with all the new advances in technology that had been made since the 1970s, the mystery was well worth re-examining. And if you're as fascinated by forensic science as I am, I think you'll find what they did with the teeth incredibly interesting. In conjunction with the University of Bergen, the police began to conduct several tests, and these involved isotope analysis. This was the first time it had ever been done by the authorities in Norway, and the aim was to try and help determine the environment the woman had been in whilst her teeth were initially forming, i.e. where she had likely grown up. When teeth form, they leave a chemical signature, if you like, and by analysing this, the investigators were able to uncover some crucial new information about the Isdal Woman. The oxygen isotope analysis, which helped to determine the kind of water she would have been drinking as a child and where in the world this was from, plus the strontium isotope analysis, which is all to do with the food and soil present where she grew up, gave the scientists cause to believe several things. Firstly, that the Jane Doe had likely grown up somewhere along the border between France and Germany, although a link with the German city of Nuremberg was also suggested. But they found it was also possible that she may have originally been from Central or Eastern Europe and had moved further west during her childhood. Honestly, I just think it's incredible that this kind of information is able to be gathered from a person's teeth. It's amazing. Something else of note was also gained from this analysis. The theory that the woman was actually born sometime around 1930 was put forward, which would mean that the Isdal Woman could have been a good few years older than they had first estimated, closer to 40 than 30. The police also sent out a new statement to Interpol following the analysis, which read in part, quote, "The teeth showed many repairs. Several of the molars had gold caps, and the dental work is of a kind practiced in the Far East, Central or Southern Europe, and South America." Now, if you remember, when I was doing the Saw shoutouts in our last episode, I mentioned that there were two people credited as writers of a very helpful BBC article that would come up again in this tale, and they were Marit Higraff and Neil McCarthy. So Marit was one of the NRK journalists who was involved with this new phase of the Isdal Woman investigation, and together with BBC World Service producer Neil McCarthy, they began to work on something major. In 2018, they began to release episodes of their podcast entitled Death in Ice Valley, which followed the twists and turns of the new Isdal Woman investigation. And from this, an entire new community was brought together. The Death in Ice Valley Facebook group was formed, which at the time of me speaking now has over 42,000 members, and acts as a kind of crowdsourced machine of analysis, theories and in-depth discussions about the case. And what this meant is that more eyes than ever before were firmly on the case, with citizen or armchair detectives becoming just as passionate about the story as the journalists reporting on it and even the police officers investigating it. I'm going to talk through some of the key events and evidence that emerged from 2018 onwards, much of which is covered extensively within the Death in Ice Valley podcast and on their Facebook page. Of course, my summary won't be nearly as detailed as an entire documentary podcast series, but if this story has really intrigued you, you know that the BBC series is there for you to dive into afterwards. So first up, let's go back to the eyewitness I mentioned in our first episode, the one who believed he may have seen the Isdal woman shortly before she died, and remarked that the clothing she was wearing looked more suited to a trip into town than an outdoor hike. This man's name was Ketil Kversoy. He's a sea captain who lived in the Isdalen area at the time the unnamed woman's remains were found. In the documentary series, Marit and Neil track Ketil down and interview him about what he saw on that day, which was then 48 years prior. Although there are some discrepancies in his recollections, for example, he believed he saw the Isdal woman on a Sunday afternoon, yet it was on the Sunday morning when her burnt body was discovered. Many think that this could be down to the passage of nearly 5 decades affecting his memories. What he revealed were further details about the sighting of the person he believes to be the now infamous unidentified woman. He said that when he spotted her, he was surprised to see her coming up the mountain, especially considering that he had not seen anyone else on the trail for the past couple of hours. But what's more is that he said she was not alone, that she was being trailed by 2 men walking around 20 meters behind her. What he revealed next chilled me to the bone. He told the BBC, quote, "She was looking at me and her face, to me it looked like she was scared and she was giving up. When she looked at me, I felt that she started to say something, but she didn't, and then she looked behind her and saw these men. I'm sure she knew they were going after her." Ketil said that he did eventually tell the police about his experience, but that it took him quite some time to do so as he didn't want to look like, in his own words, a crazy man coming and telling a crazy story. I'm going to get further into my own thoughts at the end of this episode, but as someone who is very skeptical of the suicide theory, I found this incredibly interesting, especially when you consider one of the most recent updates that has emerged in connection with this case, which I'm going to get to after I cover some of the other key points from Death in Ice Valley. So for now, let's press pause on this idea that the Isdal woman may have been being followed before she died, and take a look at a few of the other leads the documentary dug into, though I must warn you that many of these are no less frustrating than the rest of the elements in this case. In the show, Marit and Neil meet metal detectorist Arne Magnus Varbo. Months earlier, he had been in the very area where the Isdal woman's remains had been found, around 40 meters from the exact spot where she died. Suddenly, a beeping sound alerted him to the presence of metal beneath the ground, and after digging in the location pinpointed by his device, he discovered something bizarre. Buried around 6 inches below the surface of the hillside, he uncovered a handbag and sensed immediately that 1, it must have been there for a very long time, judging by its condition, and 2, that it had been deliberately hidden from view. Arne decided that the evidence was far too intriguing to keep to himself, so he carefully removed the bag, stored it, and alerted the producers of Death in Ice Valley to the find. After they'd been able to view the bag, it was taken to the police, who conducted a careful forensic investigation of the item. But whilst those in the know about the discovery had grown incredibly excited, imagining that this could well be the first new break in the case in decades, this was unfortunately short-lived. Inside the handbag was nothing but soil, and it was determined that if there had been any other items inside it at one point, time had ensured that they had perished. Many had hoped that it might have contained a passport or another identifying document, but in the end it was impossible to say that it definitely had belonged to the Isdal woman at all. There was another similar situation in terms of the false hope element at least. when a box containing some of the original police investigation documents was found by a young Norwegian man. The man's uncle had been a journalist and had looked into the Isdal Woman case years prior, but had failed to return some of the police paperwork he had been allowed to analyse. Whilst it was hoped that perhaps these documents might provide some further details that hadn't previously been public knowledge, it turned out that they were simply copies of papers that many connected with the case were already aware of. In a cruel mirroring of the initial 1970s investigation, each new potential clue turned out to be of little use when it came to unmasking the mysterious woman of Ice Valley. One question that has been raised countless times in both the Death in Ice Valley Facebook page and on numerous other internet forums is, why hasn't the Isdal Woman's DNA been run through one of the big commercial genealogy databases to try and see if any familial matches are available? As I've talked about several times on the podcast, this practice of trying to find familial DNA results became a huge discussion point following the Golden State Killer investigation in the US, where the serial killer Joseph James DeAngelo was finally identified, apprehended, charged, and found guilty of 8 counts of murder, decades after many of his crimes. But, like in the case of one of the other unidentified victims I've covered here on the show, that of Manchester's Angel of the Meadow, which haunts me to this day, it turns out that things are still quite a bit more complicated in Europe. This is actually something I'm planning on looking into in much deeper detail, so watch this space. But from what I can tell so far, in the UK, for example, certain services which were used at a national level to do familial DNA testing are no longer active, which is frustrating. And both here and in other parts of Europe, there is a huge reluctance by the authorities to hand over this kind of DNA information to commercial companies. So when there are no matches found on a country's local police or government databases, the next step would be to ask one of the companies who make money from collecting customers' DNA to help them build family trees or do genetic health testing for their help. Those databases are generally way bigger because they don't just contain the DNA of those who've had run-ins with the legal system, but it looks like the ethical issues around this are a big blocker at the moment. And of course, I do understand that it is a very complex debate. In the case of the Isdal Woman, articles on the story from as recently as the last year still mention that this is likely the best hope we have of identifying the mysterious woman, and many seem to suggest that it could just be a matter of time until the Norwegian authorities grant permission for it. After all, they do have a full DNA profile for her on file. But one thing that does look quite certain is from the general testing that's been done on the Isdal Woman's DNA, the finding that she was likely originally from Southeast Europe has been backed up. And that's a start at least. So, whilst the BBC podcast last published an episode in 2021, in more recent years there have been a few more theories presented which, whilst they are intriguing, are still as yet unproven to be accurate. A couple of them hinge on the idea that she was a transient person or a sex worker, making her way around Norway and other nearby European countries before she was either murdered or took her own life, possibly with some assistance. But one theory that has cropped up time and time again, and has been more extensively discussed in the past couple of years, is the idea that the Isdal Woman really was a spy or an agent of espionage, or even a Nazi hunter. This theory, which was meticulously outlined in the Swiss German language newspaper the NZZ, drew upon much of the original evidence in the case. Factors such as the woman's constant movement from place to place, the fact she spoke in English although appeared to have a poor grasp of the language, that her handwriting appeared to have a French style to it, and many of the strange details about her death itself. plus one potentially significant new detail. According to the newspaper, a professional fact-checker who had listened intently to the BBC podcast decided to branch out on her own and do some more digging, and in doing so, she uncovered a trail that potentially led to the prominent Swiss banker and known Nazi benefactor, Francois Genoux. At this point, the fact-checker got in touch with the NZZ newspaper, and together they were able to match up some of the Isdal Woman's suspected travel dates deciphered in the original investigation, and those of Francois Genoux, especially during 1970. Now, in the article, there are lots of sub-theories presented as to what all of this could mean, and many of these are incredibly politically deep and complex. They're the kinds of things that, without presenting you with hours of historical context, it would be very difficult to fully explain here today. Plus, I'm also hyper aware that because a lot of the theories relate back to conflicts within the Middle East, it would feel very insensitive at this time to speak about any of this area of history at a surface level, especially because these theories in relation to the Isdal Woman are purely speculative. We don't know any of it for sure, but essentially the NZZ article floats a number of possible and often conflicting ideas about this potential connection. Could the Isdal Woman have been assigned by one government or another to trail Francois Genoux? If so, what was the purpose of this? To get information out of him, or was her role supposed to be that of an assassin? Alternatively, did she know Genoux, or people connected to him? And whatever the link, did the Norwegian government know more than they let on, which could explain why the investigation never really went anywhere, and was closed and the Isdal Woman buried prematurely? This has been a constant criticism within this tale. Many feel that the police at the time did an inadequate job when trying to solve the case, and it's often been noted that the verdict of suicide felt very out of place by both the public and many of those serving in the police force at the time. But to be extra clear, all of these are simply questions and unproven theories, many of which have also been raised by online sleuths at one point or another. After exploring the Genoux theory, the NZZ article also went on to mention the two men that were reported to have been following the unknown woman before she died, and there were a couple of fascinating points made in the piece about this. It suggested that perhaps if the Isdal Woman was murdered, that there were two killers. And this is maybe backed up by the final cryptic note she made on the paper that was found in one of her suitcases at the railway station. It read ML23NMM. The 23N part is widely accepted to refer to the date she checked out of the last hotel she was seen in, the 23rd of November, but the article speculates that ML and MM could refer to the initials of two people, perhaps people she was meant to meet up with. Once again, it's just not possible to say for sure, but it's a worthwhile angle to keep in mind. But the second point, and the one that really struck me, was in relation to the sleeping pills found in her system. It was discovered that these were pink in colour, which is very strange as, according to the NZZ, the tablets of this type sold in Norway at the time were white. It states that back then, the pink variety were only sold in England. When I read about this, my brain actually started to hurt. It just feels like every time you look deeper into any aspect of this story, there's another unexplained detail that emerges to add a further level of confusion. In that sense, I find this case similar to the Dyatlov Pass story, where the possible explanations feel simultaneously endless and non-existent, or at least so blurry that they feel intangible. By the way, I did just want to make the point that I did read a translated version of the NZZ article, and as we know, finer points can sometimes be somewhat lost in translation. So everything I've discussed in this section, I've done so to the best of my ability based on what the translated article displayed to me. I felt that that was important to mention. I'm going to conclude with my thoughts based on everything I've covered over these past 2 episodes. And like everyone else captivated by this tale, all I can do is guess as to what I think might have happened to the Isdal woman. First and foremost, I do believe that she was killed. I've really tried to look at this case from all sides, and I just can't get my head around the idea that she set herself on fire, especially considering the number of sleeping pills that were in her system. It just doesn't add up to me that she would have been physically able to complete that action in what I can only assume was an incredibly drowsy state, if she was even properly conscious at all. I'm sorry to get into this horrible detail, but because her belongings were placed around her in what was described as a ritualistic fashion, if she had indeed been fully awake and set fire to herself, I can't imagine that the scene around her would have remained so purposefully set out. Surely she would have made involuntary movements due to the intense pain that would have disrupted this arrangement of her items. Of course, these are just my own opinions. I could be completely wrong, but these are the thoughts that have really stuck with me throughout. As for who she was and why she was killed, I just truly have no idea. I feel like I've considered everything, including the possibility that she may have been sadly suffering from a mental breakdown and had met with foul play at the hands of someone who had spotted a woman in a vulnerable situation and chosen to make her their victim. But I swing between thoughts like this and the theory that she really was a high-level secret agent. At this point, it feels like either explanation and all explanations in between could be as plausible as one another. Granted, the similarities between her travel stops and François Genou's movements during 1970 seem odd at first. But then I think about the fact that 1, I haven't seen any of this primary source information with my own eyes, and 2, if it is true, I also think about how many bizarre coincidences we've covered here on the podcast, and I start to look at all of it with a more critical eye. This really feels like a true mystery. Throughout the process of putting these episodes together, I've been worried about making sure I was doing the story justice, but I've come to realise that that task is virtually impossible in many ways, as we know nothing, at least not for sure. And I believe that's what makes this story so weird. It's the fact that so much thought and so many resources have been dedicated to it, that there are tens of thousands of people still combing over every detail, and it feels like we're still no nearer to knowing who the Isdal woman was. I do believe one thing though, and that is that some of the answers could lie in her DNA, and I would love to see some more progress made on that front. But until that time, it seems that Norway's most famous unsolved case is destined to retain its title. Well, I kind of feel like I've run a marathon and then arrived straight back at the starting line. What a frustrating, sad, bizarre journey this has been. I always look forward to hearing your views on any of our stories, but when it comes to a mystery like this, reading your theories is always extra enthralling. So do make use of that Spotify Q&A function if you're listening there, and if not, there are lots of other ways to get in touch and share your thoughts too. You know the drill by now. I will be giving you a rundown of all of our social media links shortly, but not before we pay a visit to the land of weird media. After such a heavy story, I feel like I could do with a laugh. And when I think back to watching the film I'm recommending to you in Weird Media today, I genuinely can't help but smile. When I was on the plane back from Las Vegas the other week, I watched 3 films during the journey, and the final one was Wicked Little Letters. I'd seen the trailer before, and I knew that Olivia Colman was in it, so that had already drawn me in, but I had no idea just how quirky, hilarious, and that time, shocking it would be. It's based on a true story that reminds me of the Circleville letters case I covered here on the podcast. An upstanding citizen in the seaside town of Littlehampton starts receiving these absolutely vile handwritten letters through her door, and it starts to cause a real stir in the community. The people of the town, which is in the English county of West Sussex, start to suspect that they know who the letter writer is, and the recipient, who is played by Olivia Colman, is one of the key driving forces behind trying to get to the bottom of things. Or more accurately, her father is. The main suspect is their neighbour, who is a brilliant character played by Jessie Buckley, and everything becomes quite complicated. I'm always aware that I don't want to spoil the storyline, but during that plane ride, I think I experienced every emotion possible watching this film. I laughed out loud so many times, but there were also some really sad moments too. Without a shadow of a doubt though, it's the performances that make this film. The main cast members are phenomenal, but the supporting cast are some of the funniest actors I've ever come across. It's an absolute treat from start to finish. I'm already itching to watch it again, and I keep recommending it to everybody. So it made total sense to include Wicked Little Letters in Weird Media today. Okay, it's time for some Saw shout-outs. Of course, the Death in Ice Valley podcast deserves the first mention, along with those 2 BBC articles I mentioned in part 1. There was the one by Helia Chung from May 2017, and another by the podcast creators Marit Higraff and Neil McCarthy from June 2019, plus another BBC article from 2017 about the teeth and jawbone discovery. We had the NZZ newspaper piece. That was by Marcel Gier, Forrest Rogers and Anya Lemke from June of 2023. Then there was a piece from the NRK journalists about the story, first published in November of 2016 and last updated in 2018. We had a piece from The Drum about the BBC podcast. That was from March of 2020. And finally, a number of the same sources I mentioned last time. A Discovery UK piece from May of 2022, an All That's Interesting article by Gina DeMuro, edited by John Kurowski. That was last updated in March of 2024. An article from the Norwegian site The Local, published in May of 2017. And a piece from the Press and Journal by Chris McLennan from October 2021. Phew, that was a lot. On to our social media bits and bobs now. To get in touch and let me know all about your thoughts, ideas and theories, just look up at Things Get Weird podcast over on Instagram and Threads. On Facebook, you can find us by searching for Things Are About to Get Weird. Our private discussion group is one of my favourite places on the internet. Our email address is thingsgetweirdpodcast@gmail.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode, I would be forever grateful if you'd fancy leaving us a quick rating or review wherever you're listening today. It means the world and is a speedy and free way to help support the show. Thank you so much for listening today. I'll be back next Wednesday with a brand new edition of Weird Fix. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.